Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov.
My camera's not working, so you don't know if it's really me or not. But
Right, we don't recognize the voice at all.
I apologize. It wasn't working on Friday at Shul either, so we used another computer, but I don't know why it's not working. Anyway,
It happens.
I'll figure it out not during Daf Yomi. By tomorrow morning, I'll try to figure it out. So we are going to learn with just my name. So Shavua Tov. David said he got to the 2 dots on Mem Bet Amud Aleph, 42 Daf 1, 42a. It's around 10 lines down, so hopefully everyone got that far. Let's start from there. So we're starting 10 lines down on Mem Bet Amud Aleph. The last thing our Mishnah said before, last thing our Mishnah said before the end of the parak is that if you have made tashmi shoshel nachtom, so we're talking about water that was used by the baker for their baking. Rashi explains it doesn't mean for their baking. It means for their cleanliness. So they have a tub of water, and every time you get your hands dirty with the dough, you wash your hands out in the water. So you'd have to have water at the side. Anyone who's baked, I guess, knows you have to clean your hands off. And if that water, you should throw it away, says the Mishnah. Right? So the Mishnah said, let me find the Mishnah. It said, you should dump it out because there's little bits of dough, presumably, flour and dough that stay in the water that over time will become chametz. Says the Braita, says the Gemara, Tani Chada, one Braita teaches us, shofchim b'makom madron. You have to pour them out on an incline, a place where they're going to roll down and go down, not necessarily to the sea, but go down, not collect, basically, a place where they're going to run off. And ein shofchim b'makom ha'ishboren, but don't pour them into a place. Rashi says it's sort of where there's like a ditch, where there's rocky formation, and basically where they'll collect in the ground. And the reason is, now it's a little bit debatable, what's the reason? But the simplest explanation is that it's in your house and that it's in your reshut, and you don't want to have chametz. Remember, this is not chametz yet, right? It's water with flour, but over time it will become chametz, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever time. And you don't want that in your reshut on Pesach. The question of whether or not, if it's not in your reshut, whether you have to worry if it's in the street, whether there's chametz is debatable. But anyways, the simplest is that it's in your own possession. But Tanya Idach, but another Braita says, shofchim b'makom ha'ishboren, that you can dump the water out into a place where it's not going to run off, where it's going to collect. So how could you explain that? Lokasha hadinafishi. It depends on whether it's a lot of water. If it's a ton of water, then dikavu, it will collect, right? Or dikavu hamayim, and then it won't get absorbed into the ground, right? The ground can only, a certain amount can go in, but not too much. And so if you have too much water, then you shouldn't pour it where it will sit and become chametz. You should pour it on a hill where it will run down and run away. But if it's a little bit, if you're baking, your matzah for breakfast, you have a little bit of water, then you don't have to worry about it. You could just dump it out into the yard, and that's the lo kavo, because it won't gather together. It won't sit there. Amar Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, further on the topic of making matzah, or making bread on Pesach, meaning not chametz. Isha lo talush el b'mayim shelanu. A woman, we always talk about women, but of course men are allowed to do this too. But a person who is kneading bread or dough on Pesach should only use water that was lun overnight, that stayed overnight. Right? We're all familiar with this halacha, I think, from matzah. They use mayim shelanu. Rashi says that the reason for this is that in the spring, in the aviv, in the springtime, the water in the springs is warm. That the earth heats up in the spring. I'm not sure what the physics of this is, but the earth heats up in the spring, and the water gets warm. And so it's essentially, remember we talked about earlier, and we're about to talk in this sugya, about not using warm water when you make matzah, because warm water becomes chametz faster. And so you shouldn't use water that was newly drawn from a spring, because it's going to have some warmth to it. Now it's a little tricky, because obviously it could be cold water from the spring. But Rashi says there's some chamimut, there's some heat, some energy in that water. So you leave it out overnight. let it become room temperature, let it cool down, and then use it for your matzah. And of course, we do this, but that's what he brought with Yehuda told him. Now, Darsha Rav Matna bePapunya. Rav Matna got up at his lecture in Papunya, and he announced this. He said, Rav Yehuda said, a woman should not need Ella Wimayim Shilanu. Unfortunately, in Papunya, they weren't so good at Hebrew, right? Their Hebrew was not so good. So they were used to, I guess, Aramaic, but they understood the word Shelanu to mean my water, right? You should use my water, Mayim Shelanu, in order to make matzah, which seemed like the next thing that, the rabbis came up with. You got to buy your water from me, which sounds like a good scheme. And so the next day, Aiti Kuli Ama Chatzbayo, the whole people of the town brought their buckets, Vatu the Gabe, and they came to his house the next morning. V'amrule Havlan Maya. Okay, we need some water now, right? Because they thought he meant you need our water. Amrulu, he said, no. I meant Anab Maya, the Beito Amri. I was talking about water from your house, but I was saying Shelanu, meaning water that was a lan, that slept overnight, basically. And this is what we do. I'm not exactly sure industrially, I guess they have big vats. But when I bake matzah, you draw water the night before or many nights before, and you keep it in a container so it doesn't get dirty, and you use it the next day. So you're supposed to use water that was stayed overnight. There's a whole nother Kabbalistic idea here that you're supposed to draw the water the night before and keep it, and it's shmira and it's preparing. But our Gemara seems to be just so to be room temperature. Continues the Gemara, Darish Rava, Isha lo talush b'chama, a woman who's making matzah, and again, not feminine specific, but if you're kneading matzah, don't do it in the sun, don't do it outside, because you're going to lead to heat, right? Extra heat, and again, any heat accelerates the chimutz process. V'lo b'chame chama, don't use water that sat out in the sun because it got hot. Even if it feels warm or regular, don't use it. Don't use the water that was from the around the mulyar. The mulyar, if you recall, was like this samovar, this like thing where you put coals in the middle and liquid on the outside, right? And that's how they kept their kettle, basically. So even if it's cooled down, but we assume that it never gets totally cool, that there's some heat that remains in the metal, and so you shouldn't use that water because, again, all these things could increase the risk of it becoming chametz. She shouldn't lift her hands from the oven until she finishes the whole dough, meaning you shouldn't take breaks during the process. So once you mix the flour and water and you pound it into dough, you should bake it right away without waiting, which we're very makbid on. And sarach shnei kelim, she should have, or they should have, tzricha, most people change it to, so she should have 2 different containers of water, echad shemikatefet bo, one that she, you put water on top of the dough, I guess, to prevent it from burning. I'm not sure that we do this, but you basically smear it like you do with an egg on top of challah, but they would do water on top of the dough. But you should have a separate one, a separate one that she cools her hands down in. So if you're baking and your hands become very hot, we're worried that that's going to transfer heat to the dough and make it chametz faster. And so she should have another container where she could dip her hands into to keep them cool. Okay, now it's very interesting because I bake matzah a lot of times, but I don't think we do this currently. We certainly didn't do it where I baked, and I guess there's a debate as to it doesn't seem like this is widely accepted. Some say it's because the people who are kneading it are not the ones who are baking it, meaning we now have many people in the matzah procession, right? It's not a one-person job. So this might be, if you're very, very active in one stage, you shouldn't be then that involved in the next stage unless you cool your hands down. But anyways, this is what the Gemara says. And ask the Gemara, though, the last narrow line, Iboilu, they had a question. If Avra v'lasha mahu, let's say she doesn't listen, or he doesn't listen, and they take hot water or warm water and knead the dough using warm water, do you then have to throw away that dough on Pesach? So Mar Zutra says, mutar, no problem. As long as it doesn't have chametz that's visible, you can use it. And Rav Ashi Amar Asur, Rav Ashi says you can't. Amar Mar Zutra minam minallah, says Mar Zutra, how do I know that although you're not supposed to use warm water, if you use it, as long as you don't see signs of chametz, you're allowed to use that matzah on Pesach? Tanya, we had a braita a couple days ago. It said, "Ein lo titina sa'orim b'Pesach." You're not supposed to remember latita was this process where you take the grain before you grind it and you wash it, right, to get any stones and impurities, whatever, off it. So there's a risk, of course, that when you wash it, that some of the water will be absorbed into the grain and it will cause it to be chametz. So we said, don't do that, right? Don't do latita with sa'orim. But continues the Braita, im latat, if you did it, even though you're not supposed to, then if it's nitbaku, if the grain is cracked and you see it looks like it's starting to ferment, then asurim. But lo nitbaku mutarim. If it's not cracked, it's mutar. Says Mar Zutra, that's exactly how I feel. If you, even though you're not supposed to do it because it increases the risk of chametz, if you do it, doesn't make it automatically asur. It means you can look at the dough, and as long as it looks okay, you're allowed to eat it. It's not a problem. Says Rav Ashi to him, I totally disagree. You think every, Rashi says maybe a needle or a weave, every weave is the same, meaning every halacha midrabanan, if you go against it, the solution is the same. Where Heicha de Itmar Itmar, where the Braita says that you can use it even if you went against the rule, and then you can. Heicha de lo Itmar, lo Itmar. You can't assume that every single prohibition that it says don't do it, but in one case, if you did it, we said as long as it looks okay, it's fine. It doesn't mean that every other example where the Chachamim said don't do something, if you did it, it's going to be fine. And so in this case, we don't have proof of that. But it seems like we do paskin like Mar Zutra, who said that although you're not supposed to do it, if you do it, as long as there's no sign of chametz, it's okay. And that is Hadron Lach Kol Sha'ah.
Don't we do this all the time? We compare one case to another case? I mean,
we do compare, but I mean, you can't conclude that all. I mean, he's making a very specific rule. He's saying when the Chachamim told you by chametz, right? Obviously, it's a class. It doesn't mean every single time Chachamim say don't walk in the street. It means, it's not comparing every Isser Chachamim to each other. It's saying that can you make a class of this? So basically, every time they say by dough, be careful because it can accelerate the process of chametz.
Right.
By litita, they said if you go against it, you can eat it as long as it looks okay. The question is the same thing true about hot water? Right? And that's
Elliot, it looks like the halacha is that we do allow it.
It looks like the halacha is that you do allow it, meaning as long as there's no evidence of chametz. There's a lot, we're going to see, and don't go home yet and do this, but we're going to see that there's a lot of different Braita, both we've had last week and we're going to have coming up, that talk about this checking, right? You can check the dough. Is it cracked? Is it does it look like chametz? We don't rely really on any of that nowadays, right? We do this 18 minutes as Moshe halacha Moshe Sinai. Like, if it's more than 18 minutes, they throw it away, even though really that's not the case. The 18 minutes is not hard and fast. It could be that you can actually inspect the dough, but nonetheless, that's how we paskin. I guess we're very machmir. But that seems to be the halacha.
no pun
After
intended.
18 minutes is good for Erev Pesach.
Okay. Yes, Hannah, what were you saying?
No pun intended, hard and fast.
Okay, hard and fast. There we go. Continues the new parak, third parak. Elu ovrim. Says the Mishnah, this is a very interesting Mishnah, right? We already, of course, know, and we've discussed that chametz involves, we said, any of the 5 grains, right? And we last week enumerated what those 5 grains were, even though there was some debate as to what they were. Bechita, saora, kusman, shibol, chuel, and shifon. And you mix it with water, that becomes chametz, right? That was simple. Says our Mishnah, there's a few other categories of chametz. Elu ovrim b'Pesach, the following are things that you're over on Pesach. They include, now there's 2 categories we're going to discuss in our Mishnah and for the next few days. One is called tarovet chametz, which means it's a mixture which has some amount of grain and chametz in it, but it's a minute amount. Meaning, if you eat the amount that you normally eat, you're not going to be eating a kezayit of chametz. But a part of this is chametz. So there's a small amount of grain in it. That's called tarovet chametz. The second group is something called chametz nuksha, which means hard chametz or bad chametz, which generally refers to things that are not edible or not made to be edible. Things like glue is going to be one of the examples, where you put grain into it to make it solidified, but it's not meant as a foodstuff. So says our Mishnah, Elu ovrim b'Pesach. The following are things that you're over on Pesach. Tosafot understands this means ovrim. This is ovrim min hashulchan. These are things you're not allowed to eat. Take them off the table. Kutach habav. The first example, which we've had this case before, is kutach. I don't know how to translate this in English, but kutach habavi, which is the Babylonian kutach, which is some kind of dip. And we're going to see it was a dip that was made. It was a very popular dip. It was made out of cheese, bread and salt and things like that. Maybe some vinegar. We'll see what it was made out of. But it was this dip. So that you cannot use on Pesach because there's some bread in it, as we're going to see. And shecher madai. Now beer, I think we discussed this before. Most beer in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, was made out of dates, which is not chametz, right? So, but however, in Madai, wherever Madai is, media, they made mead, I guess, out of barley. The Gemara is going to say, like we make, as Rashi says, like all of our beer, right, is made out of chametz. So that's how they made it in Madai, and that's usher. Chometz ha'adomi, vinegar that comes from Edom, which we're going to see. They put some grain into the wine, right? Mostly you make vinegar by fermenting wine, but they also put some grain in to speed that process along. And zeitom hamitzri, which is a Egyptian ale, some kind of beer or drink that's grain based that comes from Egypt. Those are going to be, as the Gemara is going to say, the 4 nations, right? Those come from the 4 countries, these 4 things we just said. And furthermore, there are 3 that are professional use. That is zoman shel tzavaim. Zoman is, not so clear what zoman exactly means, but it's something to do with, we'll see in the Gemara, with the dyers, right? So it's like the liquid that comes off after you dye things, and that contains grain in it. And amalin shel tabachim, which is we'll see some kind of dough that the bakers used to soak up the things that they were cooking. So they used it as like a cleaning agent, like a sponge, basically. And kolan shel sofrin, and the dye or the glue, not the dye, the glue of the scribes, right? So they use glue and they use grain in their glue. That's the 7 cases of our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, af tachshitei nashim, also women's makeup, which we're going to see, of course, it doesn't make any sense. Zeh klal, kol shehu mimin dagan, anything that's a type of grain, if it comes from grain, harehu over b'pesach, but harei ilu ba'azhara, you're over a lotase, ve'in behem mishum karet. But because it's not like bread, it's not edible readily, or it's not eating a kazayit, b'chtei achilat pras, you're not chayav karet for eating these on Pesach. Now, Tana Rabbana, let's try to explain what these are. Says the Braita, first just a little health minute. Shlosha dvarim nemrim b'kutach habavli. They said 3 things about this very popular, the rabbis clearly were not fans of this dip called the kutach habavli, the Babylonian special. It is mitamtem et halev. First of all, it closes up. It says timtum means stima. It closes up your heart, makes you insensitive. What?
Cholesterol or something?
No, I don't. I think they meant it more from a spiritual sense.
Oh, I see.
I don't know, but maybe it's cholesterol. And it blinds your eyes. Remember, they were terribly afraid of different kinds of salts that you would rub your eyes. That's why we do mayim achronim, right? Because they were terribly afraid that there was salt that if you put in your eye would blind you. And so this thing has a lot of salt in it. And if you eat it and you touch your eyes, you could become blind. And it weakens your body. It gives you, maybe it is cholesterol, right? It gives you a weakness. So first of all, it clogs up your arteries. Because of the liquid from the milk that was used there. Rashi explains that there must be a word for this in English, someone's going to get it, that when you make cheese, you curdle the cheese, right? And then you take out the solid part and there's liquid left behind.
Whey.
That is called the whey?
Whey is the liquid that comes from the cheese.
Oh,
Like
wow.
the nursery rhyme.
Oh my goodness. Okay, now I know what whey is. Okay, so that's this UV de chalva. So I guess they put whey into this kutach. What do people do with whey nowadays? Do you eat it?
No, they usually drain it, I think, before you buy it, but it's you can,
Okay.
it's part of the cheese making process, isn't it? I mean,
Part of the nursery rhyme. Okay. And,
It's included in cottage cheese.
oh, okay.
yeah.
Well, it doesn't sound like it's so good for you. So I guess it's got a lot of cholesterol. And it blinds you mishum milcha because of the salt. They were always very nervous about salt causing blindness. It weakens your body. Rashi explains that kumnita de is that there was, they put like little pieces of dough, I guess, in their bread, and they would get moldy because you would keep this thing for a long time. And so you'd have a lot of bacteria, or mold, maybe not bacteria, right? You'd have a lot, well, anything, but fungus, I guess, yeast in it. And so it would make people sick because you were eating, these spores of fungus, of yeast, not yeast, of mold.
Well,
So-
people people liked it nevertheless.
I guess it had a good kick. People eat all kinds of things that are bad for them, right? So, anyways, that's not has to do with Pesach. Well, that's the Braita. Taner Rabbanan, on the topic of that, Shlosha Dvarim Marbin HaZevel. There are three things that increase everything Zevel means stool, right? Your garbage, basically. Ukofevin et hakoma, and they bend your spine, they maybe weaken your bones, or they push you over. And notlin echad michamesh meot mimeor einav shel adam. They take away 1/500th of your sight. And Elohein pat kiber, bread kiber. We talked about pat kiber before, but pat kiber Rashi understands means bread that's made. Kiber Rashi understands is when you grind grain, right? You are left with the shell, the husk. And if you make bread out of that, so that's very bad. Like, it's not really whole grain bread because you're taking out the solet, you take out the grain and use the chaff, I guess, or not really the chaff, but like the kernel to make dough, to make bread out of. You can grind it up. That was a very thick whole wheat bread, not whole wheat, but natural bread that the Braita thinks is very bad for you. Shecher chadash, new beer, right? You gotta let your beer sit for a while. If you drink fresh beer, it's bad for you. And yerek chai, if you eat raw vegetables, for sure that's bad for you. So Rashi says it's referring to like raw vegetables like batzal, like onion and things like that. If you eat a lot of them, Rashi says, tamid, you always eat a lot of them. So Taner Rabbanan continues the Braita. There are three things that do the opposite. They decrease your stool. Zokfinet hakoma, they make you stand up tall. Meirinat einayim, they give you vision. Elohein patnikia, you eat very clean bread, right? And basar shamein, very fat meat. V'yayin yashan, and wine that's old. What are these things? Patnikia means the smida, which will always mean smida means solet, means the finest grain, where it's sifted and sifted and sifted. That's very healthy for you. Basar shamein does not mean any fat piece of steak. It means it's a pirta de lo iftach. It has to be a goat that never gave birth. Maybe goats don't give birth. An aiz. What's an aiz? A sheep, right? Whatever an aiz is. I thought an aiz was a goat. A goat that never gave birth. So it's
It is a goat.
as we all know, the process of childbirth takes some of the nutrients from the mother, and so the real fattest of the meat is going to be in an aiz that never gave birth. And yayin yashan is referring to atik atiki, really old wine, which to them meant 3 years old, Rashi says. So, old, I guess, meant 1 year. Atik atiki is if it's 3 years old. So that's the kind of wine that's good for you. But unfortunately, says the Braita on the second line, in general, one of the sad things in life is that kol mili de ma'ali lahai kasha lahai. Usually anything that's good for one thing is bad for something else. Right? This is unfortunately the curse, right? You take a medicine for one thing, and generally it's going to harm something else. And if it's kashi lahai, ma'ali lahai, usually things that are bad for one thing are good for something else. Libar, except for a few examples, except for bar mizangavila rativa. Zangavila is ginger, I think was usually we translate it. I think. Rashi says zinzibara. Is that a word in French of any choice? Zinzibara. Sounds like Zanzibar, but
Yeah, I never heard of it before.
okay, so I don't know. That's what
I'm not proficient in Old French, unfortunately.
Zangavil is the word.
We're relying on you, Miriam, for these.
Not on this one, I'm sorry.
Anyways, moist ginger, I think that's what it means. Pilpula richta, long peppers. I don't exactly know if that means the kind that we see that are long or some other type. Patnikia, this clean bread. Basar shamein, fat meat. Aviyayin yashan, and old wine. Demali, the kule gufa. Those things are good for everything. So there's a few things that are all winners. Okay, anyways, back to our Mishnah. Sheikhar HaMadai, the Rama Mesari. The reason you can't drink beer that's from Madai is unlike our beer, meaning the Gemara's beer that was made out of dates that fermented. They put saurin, they put barley into their beer, and that's how they make it. So, like we do today, or most people do today, right? Or not most people. In Rashi's time, all people did it. We use other things. We use hops, I guess, but
so it's chametz.
It's chametz, but as the Mishnah is saying, this is not considered to be chametz or chayiv karet.
I know. Why not? If it's
only a
chametz,
small amount, because the amount of chametz that you consume over time, meaning most of it's liquid, is water or whatever.
let's see.
So it's a tarovet chametz.
I see.
We're going to keep discussing it, but it is also midoraita. It's not like it's a drabanan. It's just not karet. Chometz ha'adomi. Now, why would you be chayav for vinegar, right? I don't know how we make vinegar nowadays, but I know that vinegar is old wine. That's what at least what I was taught. So presumably there are other ingredients. So says the Gemara, because in order to make this vinegar in Edom, they were shati beisari. They would drop a sorim. They would drop a barley into it to make it ferment, to make it get to be vinegary. Amr of Nachman betchila, says Rav Nachman betchila, back in the old days. That says the old days meaning when there was a Beit HaMikdash and people used to bring a lot of wine to the Beit HaMikdash for their karbanot. Kishayim meviyin nisachim mi Yehuda. When they used to bring nisachim from Yehuda, there was a special blessing for the grapes and the wine of Yehuda that lo hayayenam she Yehuda machmitz. The wine of Yehuda would never become chometz, would never become vinegar, which was good if you like wine, but was not good if you like vinegar, right? Because you need vinegar. So says the Braita ad, or says the Gemara, Rav Nachman, ad shenotin tochan saorim. They would have to put in saorim. You'd have to supplement it because the wine was such high quality that if you just let the wine sit, it wouldn't become bad. You know, like nowadays, I don't know what wine everyone here drinks, but there's certainly wines where they sit for a year and they're terrible, right? But most higher quality wines are not like that. They could sit for ages. And so the wine of Yehuda was so good that it wouldn't become chometz, it wouldn't become vinegar unless they put inside of it, you know, some grains that would help ferment the process, that would accelerate that process. That's what they would call chometz. But chometz did not mean wine that went to vinegar. It meant wine that had added saorin to make it into vinegar, because otherwise it would not become that. But achshav, nowadays, it's ba'avotenu harabim, now that there's no Beit HaMikdash, and now that we're not bringing karbanot anymore, our wine is terrible, or not so good, and it's the Edomim, right, the enemy. The Edomites, ein yenam shel Edomiyim machmitz ad shenotin tochan saorin. It's the wine of Edomiyim that's very high quality nowadays. The koronoto chometz ha'adomi, and that's what we call chometz ha'adomi, which is very high quality wine that only becomes vinegar when you add grain to it to accelerate that process. The Kayim Mashenemar, and it fulfills the verse of Yecheskel, who says, Ilmale hachareva. Ilmale hachareva. I will fill up one and destroy one. Which really the pasuk means to say, I will fill you up with destruction. But we darshan it that im milei azu charevazu. Right, that there's this yin and yang with Edom and Bnei Yisrael. If one of them is destroyed, the other is full. And if milei azu charevazu. If one is full, the other one is destroyed. And furthermore, of course, we're familiar with this concept from Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Mehacha, ulaom milaom ye'amatz. Right, as Rivka heard when she was pregnant and she had these two babies inside of her, and the pasuk says that they said to her, you know, they'll go from strength to strength. One will control, or the other one, meaning when one is up, the other one is down. And so they're using this as an example. We used to have very high quality wine in Yehuda, and now the very high quality wine comes from Edom. And therefore, the relevance to our Mishnah is that when they want to make it into chometz, into vinegar, they have to add grain to it, and therefore it's chametz. And that's the point. So the chometz.
Are we assuming the Edomites made kosher wine?
I guess so. Not such a far-fetched idea, or maybe it was before the Gezerah, but yeah, let's say they're making kosher wine. And ashkacha.
It's not referring to Christians here?
I doubt it. I don't really know for sure, but I doubt it.
I mean, because Edom is identifiable with Christianity, even in Gemara times.
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe. But James, it could also be Jews making wine from grapes in Edom, right? I'm not sure that it's, I don't think it's the Edomites who made the wine, it's the location of the wine, right? It's the grapes. And so that's more likely, I guess, than that they were,
but they're talking about the nations here.
Right.
One nation is up, the other nation is down.
Okay, so we could say it's well, I know Christianity is not a nation, but right. So
I understand, but it's a people.
Rome was, right?
It could be.
Edom is not really Rome, right? Edom is its own country.
Well, it was identifiable. It was identified with Rome. And
okay,
rabbinic.
I'll go with Rome then. Tanya now continues the bright to Rabbi Yehuda. Interesting halacha, and this is actually a little bit relevant. Not a little. This is very relevant nowadays. Yehuda in Yehuda, meaning in Israel. Berishona lokeh chometz ve'amaretz. Originally, remember back in the good old days, if you bought vinegar from an Am Haaretz, Eino Tzarech La'aser, you did not have to take Maaser from that vinegar. Why not? Remember, anything you buy from Am Haaretz is called Demai. And generally with Demai, you have to take Maaser because you're afraid they didn't do it. The reason you don't have to is because Chazaka Eino Ba'ela Min HaTemed. We can assume that it came from Temed. Now, Temed, if you recall, is like the dregs of wine, right? So you take wine and you take grapes, you crush them, you make wine, and then you take, now there's Temed was essentially, you take the byproduct of that, right? I don't know if there's a better word for it. We call it shmarim, right? Which are the things you stood out and crushed, but there's a lot left there, right? There's a lot of material, like anyone who crushes a lemon, right? Or whatever you crush, you know that there's a lot left. So you would take that and you would soak water into it, and some of the juice of that would go into the water and it would make it into a poor kind of wine, right? A second-rate kind of wine. And so says the Breita, because of that, you don't have to take off maaser, which we'll see why not. I mean, if it's wine, it's wine. But that seems to be you don't have to take off maaser. But nowadays, nowadays, if you buy chometz from an Am Haaretz, you do have to take maaser because right? Because the only way to make chometz is to actually use wine nowadays. Back in the old days, because the wine was so good, the grapes were so strong, you didn't have to use the actual wine to make chometz. And maybe if you use wine, it would never become chometz. Right? The wine was so good that it never became vinegar. You'd have to use the dregs in order to make vinegar. And so that's why nowadays chometz is assumed to come from wine, from grapes, and therefore you have to take maaser if you buy it from Am Haaretz. But back in the old days, you didn't have to. Says the Gemara, what does that implies? V'savar Rabbi Yehuda, is it true that Rabbi Yehuda holds a temed lav bar asuriyu? Rabbi Yehuda holds a temed you don't have to take maaser for. Hatanya, we have a beferish Breita, which says the following. It says, it's a Mishnah. We have a Mishnah which says, Mishnah in Masrot, Hamitamed v'noten mayim b'midah. Let's say you're taking temed, you're taking the dregs of wine, you add water with a certain measurement. You add, say, a gallon of water, right? You let it soak for 5 days or whatever, 5 years, and you come back and you drain it out. And what you find in your bucket is a gallon of wine, right? Umatzah kidei midato. You find the exact same measure. So you have the same amount that you had when you started. Then you're patur from maaser, right? Now remember, if you had more, right, let's say it soaked and it broke down and you went from a gallon to a gallon and a half, you would have to assume that the extra is real wine, grapes, and you'd have to take maaser. But since nothing was added, it was just sat there, you don't have to give maaser from that, right? Which is what I just explained to you. But Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayev. So the Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah says you have to give maaser because even though there's nothing tangible, right? The fact is it did change. The liquid went from water to wine, and so you have to give maaser for that. So how could Rabbi Yehuda here say that in Yehuda, in the old days where all of the vinegar came from temed, from the dregs, that you don't have to give maaser if you buy it from Am Haaretz? Why not? You should be chayiv maaser from that. Says the Gemara, well, it's true. But hachikamer, this is what we mean to say. Although you have to give maaser, it's a tiny bit of maaser, right? Because you imagine how much did the grapes contribute to this thing? Maybe 2%, 5%. So the amount of maaser you have to give might be a few ounces of liquid. And because it's such a small amount, they weren't nechshedu amei aretz ala temed. They weren't choshed them. Remember, we said that generally an Am Haaretz gives maaser most of the time, but we're worried that they're not going to do it if it's very expensive. But this, because it's so cheap, basically, because it's such a small contribution, and therefore such a small amount of maaser, we assume that they're going to do the right thing, and therefore you don't have to give demai because you can assume that they did the proper thing.
I would make the other assumption. It's so small, they just say, it's not worth it.
No, but I think that's the assumption that we make. Again, this is not the sugya, is that the Am Haaretz wants to do the right things. They know the halacha, they want to do it, but they're not that committed. So if it's expensive or complicated, they're not necessarily going to do it. They don't want to lose a lot of money. But there, where you're selling a gallon of temed, right? You're selling a gallon of vinegar, but it's 2%, grapes by volume or something like that. So maaser would be 10% of 2%, right?
I get it.
Very small amount.
Yeah.
Another answer might be that there's different, that they are nechshedu, that you don't trust them. Lokasha, but the Ravka, Habitu portsani. It depends on what exactly you soak it in. In fact, there's two different kinds of dregs. You can have dregs from the grapes themselves, where you stand on the grapes and you crush them. And then after you crush them and get wine, you re-soak them. That's considered to be much closer to the grapes, right? Because there's actually exchange that goes on. There's liquid that comes from the grapes. Rashi points out, you didn't increase your volume. You might not have increased your volume because some of the water was absorbed by the grapes, right? And some of the juice went into the water. So basically, it was equilibrium, but you definitely gained something from those grapes. And there you'd have to give maaser. Where you don't have to give maaser is if you soak water with like the leaves or the seeds, the pits. The parts of the grape that really have no real juice in them. They might have some flavor. They definitely have flavor, but that's a real poor man's wine. And there's actually no real contribution from the grapes, and you don't have to give maaser. Continue the Mishnah. The next case was Zaytom HaMitzri, right? So I told you Zaytom HaMitzri was some kind of Egyptian drink. My Zaytom HaMitzri, Tani Rav Yosef Tlata Sari, was a third grain, third barley. Tlata Kortami, a third Kortami. I have no idea what Kortami is, but I got 4 words, so if someone can help us out. Karkom is one of them. Morika, Charia, and Satim. Those are all words Rashi apparently uses in different places, but I don't know what any of them are. So a third of this, I don't know if it's a liquid. I don't know idea. Krug.
So karkom is like saffron. It's a curcuma.
Okay.
It's a spice.
Okay. So a third spice, we'll say, which sounds like a lot, right? Okay. A third grain, a third of spice, a plata milcha, and a third salt. Maybe they added water to this. Maybe this was like the solid part, and they added water, but I'm not really sure.
It's obviously a dry rub.
Okay, so it's a paste, we're going to say. I'll take that.
Yeah, the saffron makes it yellow.
A dry rub, but you eat it somehow. Right? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, something. Rav Papa that was Rav Yosef said, that it was barley. Rav Papa mapik sari. Rav Papa said, no, when I make this zaytom, I don't include sari, mile chiti. I put wheat. So not barley, but wheat. And how are you going to remember which recipe to use, right? If you didn't have a cookbook. Simanech sisni. What is sisni? It's samach. So Rav Yosef included sa'arim, seorim. So the samach and of Rav Yosef goes with the seorim of his karkom. Not his karkom, his zaytom. I thought this was a drink, like a beer, so I maybe I'm wrong. But anyways, it's definitely something you eat. So that's how you remember. What do you do? Oh, here we go. The Gemara says, I'm sorry, let's keep going. Taralahu, you soak it. So you do soak it in water. The kalalahu, and then you pop it, right? You put it on the heat. The tachnilahu, and then you grind it. And the shatilahu, and then you drink it. Midabichna vadatzerta, from Pesach till Atzeret. The kumit, if you're all binded, if you're all, your bowels are not going, you're constipated, then marpulate, it'll release you. Or the rafi, if you're a little bit too loose, you have diarrhea, then mekamitle, then it will bind you, right? It'll help you out. But if you're sick, and if you're pregnant, then it's perilous. Don't drink this stuff.
It's Metamucil. Fiber.
Does Metamucil work both ways though? No, Metamucil works one way. This is magic. This works either way. Whichever's wrong, it fixes. See, if you James, if you make this and you start selling it, you'll make a killing. Killing literally. Okay. Zuman shel tzabaim. Now, those are the 4 we said from the countries. Now we get the 3 of the professions. Zuman shel tzabaim, which I said was the juice of the dyers. Hacha tergimu. Here they explained that it meant maya de chiyuri de tzaba be lava. It's this white water or whatever, or some kind of water that they soaked lava with. Rashi says lava was some kind of white thing. Elsewhere, Rashi says it was a red thing. Either way, it was a dye that basically was used to soak. You put your clothes in, and then you'd have water left behind. But one of the things that they used in the mixture was grain. They used grain to make the dye. Amilan shel tabachim. What is amilan shel tabachim? Tabachim are bakers, right? Pat tfua, that's referring to bread that's made from grain, shelo havia shlish. they would take this really terrible grain, which was unedible, right? It wasn't even a third done. It was like immature grain that was stunted or whatever reason. You took it and you make it into, you grind it, you make it into bread, and that you use shemnicha pikdera. You would put it on the surface of the pot, and it would basically sponge up and suck up all the bad stuff. So all the bad smells and oils and things that came out of the things they were baking or cooking would go into this bread. But it wasn't really meant to be eaten. It was meant to basically serve as a cleansing agent. But if you ate it, then it's chametz because it's bread. But it's not real chametz because it's not meant to be eaten. It's meant to be used for this purpose. And therefore, you're not chayiv karet, but you are chayiv alotase if you eat it on Pesach. And the final case we had, the seventh case, not the final case, was kolan shel sofrin, which hacha terguma, here they translated it as perura de ushkapi. It was the glue of, and Rashi has the beautiful word of glue, of the ushkapi of the ushkapi are the dye, the ones who make leather. What do you call a person who makes leather? The leather makers. Tanner, thank you. And so they would use this glue. It was like, let's say you had two pieces that came apart, and you wanted to glue it together, or if you want to make two layers, or they'd sometimes make double layered leather. I guess was very good for whatever. And so you would, shoes, right? Shoes are probably, you need multiple layers. So you would glue it together, and the glue included grain. That's how you made the glue. You would use some kind of paste that used grain. Where am I? No, this is not referring to a glue that was used by the tanners. It's referring to this like cream that was used by the rich women, the rich girls, right? The daughters of the rich people. They would, when they had leftover, so they would use this. We've talked about this many times, especially in Shabbos, that they would use creams to take, mainly to take hair off, but also to smooth their skin. So you would take like a paste, right? You would put it on the skin and then you pull it off to soften the skin and depilatate it. So this would be the paste that was used by the Benot Ashirim. And why does it say Shel Sofrim, right? Of the where's Sofrim? The scribes, because it's referring to the ones that would leave over for the daughters of the Sofrim, who were of course poor. The scribes are always poor, right? So they would leave it over for them. They're extra, but it would be chametz, and that's what it's referring to. That's why. What do you mean? Eini hatanat be'Rabbi Chia arba'a midei medina shlosha minei umnat, right? Our Mishnah is talking about 4 things that are affiliated with the country and 3 that are affiliated with professions. But if you're telling me this is referring to a cream that's used to clean or to smooth a body, then what does that have to do with the profession? It's referring to this cream of the rich daughters of the rich people. My mine umnatika. What does that have to do with the profession? El, you're right. That's wrong. My perura de ushkapi. It is the perura de ushkapi. Well, this is a rhetorical. Elamai, it's the perura de ushkapi. It's the glue that's used by the tanners. Amai karele haikulan shel sofrim. Why are you saying it's the kolan of the scribes? It's not the scribes. It's the ratzanim. It's the tanners. Kolan shel ratzanim mibayle. No, you're right. It's perura de ushkapi. It's the glue that you use on the leather. And my kareli kolan shel sofrim. The sofrinami madbikin bu neirotehem. The sofrim would also use it for their parchment, right? Parchment, which of course is a byproduct of leather, right? Of skin. So they would have to glue together the parchments like we do today with the Sefer. Well, now we don't glue them actually. We tie them together. But there's, when you made a book, you would glue together the edges of the parchment, and that glue was made out of chametz. So let's say you come in on Pesach and you're really hungry, and you take your carrot and you dip it into that glue and eat it. You're crazy, first of all, but you're also over on chametz, or at least for eating chametz on Pesach because it's made out of grain. Okay. Now it has to be ra'oi lachilat kelev, or else it makes no sense at all, right? But let's assume it is ra'oi lachilat kelev. We can do a little more, or we want to stop?
Keep going. I don't know, it's up to you. You're doing tomorrow.
I have to go.
Let's stop. We'll pick it up tomorrow from the 2 lines.
Okay.
Okay.
Everyone, Shavua Tov. We'll see you tomorrow morning.
Tov.
Thank you, Alicia Vuatto.